Hey guys, well, welcome to our ongoing May focus on what it looks like for real people like you and me to engage with a call and engage a process of growth and transformation through pursuing that call as we connect with God in the midst of all of it. So we're looking at the story of Gideon to kind of expound on this and draw out some principles for what that looks like for each of us in our own lives practically. So we're going to pick right up with where we left off last week. We are in Gideon chapter 7, and previously, just to kind of review what we've been talking about, we've kind of illustrated this principle or this progression that begins with receiving a call where something that's on God's heart and something that is on our heart and our attention kind of meet, and God invites us to engage a journey, an adventure of growth and transformation that is going to both help address that issue or that need and draw us into a deeper level of growing and maturing and relating with Him. That leads us into a process of consecration, which then prepares us for the next stage, which is all about testing the call. And it's in that testing the call process, which was our focus last week, that we kind of gain the footing and the confidence to prepare us so that we're able to respond to God's invitation to move into a process of commitment where He asks us to do some things in pursuit of this call that don't make sense to us, that don't make sense to other people, that seem illogical or maybe even, suicidal in the sense of, this will clearly mean the end of everything. But He asks us and invites us to engage with Him in the discipline of some things that don't make sense to us for a variety of reasons, which we'll see more of those reasons today as we then move into what that sets us up for, which is the final phase, which is all about pursuing the call and actually kind of seeing it come to pass. So that's where we're going to pick up. We are in chapter 7, Judges chapter 7, verse 8. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterwards, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So a couple of really interesting things going on right here at the beginning, right? So when Gideon is at his lowest, his most maybe discouraged, the sense that, wow, I've blown it, this is not going to happen. Now there's no way with 300 men that we can pull this off. God says, hey, congratulations, you did it. You are now ready. We're ready to do this. Now's the time to attack. But I think it's really encouraging to me here that God is recognizing how difficult it is for us to engage that kind of thing, right? So he's saying, now's the time. Get up, go do this. We're going to do this. It's going to succeed. I'm going to give it into your hands. But if you're still afraid, and when he says if, obviously what he really means is, I know you're afraid. So go do this thing. Let's go on a little scouting mission, and we're going to kind of build up your confidence. But I do think it's illustrative to recognize that even that is still a step that he's requiring Gideon to take, right? It's not, boop, here's my magic wand. You're now filled with random faith and courage out of nowhere, and you're all built up and ready to go. No, he's saying, despite that, continue, eyes on me, Gideon, right? Eyes on me. And come on, take this step. I want you to go down to the camp at least. But it's still something Gideon had to take a deep breath. And, there's a risk involved here. What if I'm caught and captured if this little scouting mission goes awry? But he responds and he takes the step, and then God is able to meet him in that progression. That's a theme that we've been seen running throughout this entire process of pursuing a call. That's, I think, one of the most instructive principles for ourselves out of this whole process is that routinely pursuing a call God's way requires us to get up and take a step before we know how it's going to work, before we feel like it's going to work, before we feel like it makes sense, before we feel like we've got it all sorted out and we know the plan. There's a continual process, not once, but multiple times, of God requiring a step, an actual active step, right? Notice it's not just like an internal heart thing. It's no, go and do this thing in pursuit of the call, regardless of what you think or how much you think it makes sense. Take the step based on what you believe about who I am as God and how we are engaging in this thing. But it's still, it's like a graduated step, you know, God's saying like, I recognize that you're afraid and this is a lot for you. So I'm going to have you do this now to build up your confidence so that you're able to fully engage with the victory that I prepared for you. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So Gideon and his servant, they go down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. And his friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. So, again, a couple of interesting things going on here, right? Obviously, that's a great, I love, again, that there's kind of this delightfully, I find, sarcastic irony thing going on here where, you know, the guy's like, oh, I had this dream, a loaf of bread came and crushed our tent, and then his friend is like, well, obviously, there's only one thing that could mean. That has to mean Gideon, the son of Joash the Israelite, and God's, you know, what? No, it doesn't. So God is very, very graciously giving Gideon this, faith jolt, this little bit of a supercharge, right? And I think that all of us who have gone through all the way to the end, this process of pursuing a call, recognize what that looks like, right? You can learn to look for those divine appointments and, you know, those supernatural little windows of confirmation and recognize them for what they are, which is God very graciously kind of giving us a piece of something that we can take and go, okay. Like, yes, you know, even though the external still look grim, that thing that just happened, like that is so obviously God, that is so clearly God signaling to me and engaging with me in this process. I'm going to take that, I'm going to hold on to it for all it's worth as the encouragement that it is meant to be for me, that I'm not crazy and I'm on the right track, and I'm going to stick with this thing and continue leaning into God and into that relationship. So God very graciously does that, and it does its job. It jolts Gideon up, and he is like, wow, hearing that clearly, like there's no way to interpret that any other way. So he goes back to the camp. Get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands. And dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. Watch me, he told them. Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Really cool things here. One thing to note, it's so awesome to me in this moment, right? Gideon has now fully become the very thing that God saw in him and spoke out at the beginning when he received the call, but it was very much not, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. That was not who Gideon was at the beginning of this process. And here we are now. Notice the call itself hasn't actually been accomplished, but one of the primary purposes of the call has been accomplished. Gideon has actually grown, and the things that God knew were resident in him, those aspects of who he was, have been refined and brought out and matured and made real in a way that I don't think would have happened if Gideon was still back hiding in the wine press trying to thresh some wheat for the next day's bread, right? The process that God has brought him through has actually brought out in him the very things that God saw and spoke about him at the beginning. We now reach the end, and here he is, Gideon leading his men. The guy who began by saying, who am I? No one's going to listen to me. No one's going to follow my lead. I'm the least of the least of the least, is now saying, watch me, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. I know what's going on here, guys. Get on my 6 and let's do this thing. I mean, that's such a massive transformation, and I think is really awesome illustration to us of one of the primary purposes of engaging God through these journeys of pursuing call. It's because that, and it will look lots of different ways because we are all different. Like, not all of us, that's what was being brought out in Gideon. What's being brought out in each of us will be different things, but that same progression that God wants to take us through is available to all of us as we respond in faith to this process that he's inviting us into, which I think is really, really cool. So, verse 19, Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the end of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, so middle of the night. just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. And the three companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hand and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. I'm going to keep going here before we break this down. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth Shittah towards Zerah, as far as the border of places that are hard to pronounce. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all of Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites, seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth Barah." So basically, this interesting process happens, right? 300 men, notice, without lifting a sword, without striking a blow of their own, just defeated this army by sending it scattering. So let's break this down a little bit, because this is a story that's really easy to go, oh, how quaint, how cute, how interesting. Like, yeah, all things are possible. There's more going on here than that, right? What I find so fascinating about this whole sequence is that the very process that God took Gideon through, which originally he was explicitly saying, and it was certainly the case, that his purpose for doing this was so that he would be glorified in the victory, and that Israel wouldn't get all puffed up and go, oh man, we're just so awesome, we pulled this off. Hey Gideon, you're pretty cool and we're pretty cool, and that's about as far as this goes because we did it, right? God doesn't want that to happen. So he wants to make explicitly clear and totally unmistakably certain that there's no way to interpret this in any other way than that God sovereignly did something. He wants that to be really clear, and he already said that, right? But something else was also going on here. Because God knows more than we do, right? We can all agree on that. Because God knows more than we do, and he knew more than Gideon and the Israelites knew, he actually created, through asking Gideon to do these difficult things that were, stretching and like everybody was like, man, this is the wrong way to do it, right? Yes, partly it's so that it could be set up so that God could be glorified, but also God was actually creating the circumstances for the victory that he saw that nobody else saw in that situation, right? He was aware of a potential victory that could only be accomplished a certain way, a victory that 300 men could win when 30,000 couldn't. Basically, he pulled off a really awesome psychological warfare maneuver, and some of the clues to what was really going on here are already given out for us. We just don't tend to understand the context of what was going on. So we've been talking about the Midianites, right? They say, oh, the Midianites, but notice how every time when they talk about the army, they say the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples. So this is actually not a cohesive army. It's not like what we would think of as an army that has chains of command and a well-organized structure. It's more like a giant-ass raiding party, right? Like the Midianites are kind of leading the show, and then a lot of their kind of neighboring, loosely affiliated cultural tribal units, they've all kind of gotten together in a big enough group that because the Israelites are fractured and they aren't getting together tribally, they're not able to like rise up and deal with it. Each individual Israelite tribe is outmatched by this kind of basically raiding horde that has kind of gotten together to sweep through the land and take all this stuff. So, but what we tend to forget about that is that means that army, that the eastern peoples, whatever, they are not cohesive. In fact, it takes a very strong hand and a lot of discipline to keep a force like that together, because a lot of old grievances tend to be at work, a lot of old grudges tend to be at work, a lot of jealousies, a lot of factional rivalries, like the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all of the eastern peoples. They're working together towards a common goal, but I could give you lots and lots and lots of examples throughout history that help us understand that, like, it's more like a bunch of bullies getting together to pick on the weak kid, but, a bunch of bullies getting together, like, that is not like the strongest of bonds here. We're not talking about Band of Brothers quality material here. So God actually sets up a really amazing kind of psychological warfare thing, even down to, like, notice how the sentries that Gideon was overhearing at the outposts around the camp, the way that they're talking, why would they say, oh, well, I had this dream that this bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. And then his friend is like, oh, yeah, God has given the Midianites and the whole. I don't think that those two sentries were Midianites. They were other people. So basically, there's this factionalized thing going on here in the camp of the eastern peoples, where there's disjointedness, maybe even typically distrust to some degree. Like we're not as cohesive as maybe we appear from the outside. And so note what happens is that then. So let's now go over here for a second. When armies operated, right? So trumpets isn't just for making noise. Trumpets were for trumpets, and torches for nighttime were signaling instruments, right? Because we don't have radios, we don't have cell phones and all that other stuff. So ancient armies had pretty elaborate, usually very sound systems, trumpets, drums, that kind of thing. Something that was distinct enough to be heard over the noise of battle, where you could give commands to different parts of the army and coordinate, right? So the idea, if you've got 300 men with trumpets and torches, typically, like, there would usually only be about one trumpet for some reasonably large number of, like, at least several hundred men, right? So this small group of 300 men, each one has a trumpet, but to the enemy, that represents an even larger force than Gideon had originally assembled in the first place. Because if there's that many trumpets and that many torches, and of course we assume that it's 1 to several hundred, right? Wow, that's a lot. Like, we are in some serious trouble here, because that's a huge force that has just risen up to come at us, right? So track some of the cultural relevance of what's going on here. So the Midianites and the rest of the people down in the camp suddenly see this thing which they can only interpret as being they've been ambushed by an enormous army, and the Midianites flee, right? Notice it said, so they held the position around the camp, they don't charge down, all the Midianites run, crying out as they flee. And then later on, then says, God said, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. So we can't read 100% too much into that. We don't know exactly what played out per se, but my interpretation just historically is that tensions that were already at work in that army, in that camp, boiled over in that moment, and some combination of the fact that one faction was fleeing and trying to save their own hides at the expense of the others, that they're about to be swarmed over. It's possible that some portion of the army was trying to kind of get good with the Israelites by joining their side. Like these are all things that have happened it could give you other historical examples of times where similar things have played out. There's examples from Chinese history and just other interesting, we don't have time to get into it, but interesting times where an army that, because again, we hear the word army and we think army like today, where we have really, well-defined command structures, rigid discipline, a strong sense of unity. That is not the kind of army we're talking about. We're talking about a bunch of guys who got their weapons and said, let's go raiding for the season. That sounds like fun. Not very coordinated. And somehow, basically, God knew enough of what was going on in the enemy camp that he created the situation where, without striking a blow, without losing a man, Gideon and his forces could turn the enemy against itself and create victory in a really awesome way. And then, because now this army has been scattered and they're fleeing, and that sense of, oh wow, this is possible, then all of the other Israelite tribes from Naphtali and Asher and Manasseh and Ephraim, they all rise up, and now the Israelites, who ironically were always strong enough to do this to begin with, if they had just actually worked together and had faith to do that coordinatedly, now that the victory's been won, then they all rise up and they actually make it happen by being inspired, and they charge out and they chase them down and they pick them apart piecemeal and kill all the leaders of the whatevers, and the thing is resolved well. So I think it's really, really important to recognize a huge part of what is going on here, the two principles to draw out from this story when it comes to us pursuing the call. First principle, which we've already named, is that there's this time where, when we're moving over from the commitment phase, it's important that we don't get so focused and stuck on that part of the process when God's saying, wait, not yet, refine this, let's do this thing over here, and it all feels like maybe it's not working out right. When God says, okay, now's the time, attack, we need to be ready to hear that and respond, even if the response is a kind of a graduated response where we take at least the first step that we do see that we feel comfortable with. When that shift happens, we are ready and we step into that. So don't miss God's call to action because we either are too busy, woe is meing over how, things have seemed to have gone to seed, and, oh, it's been too long, I'm out to pasture, or, oh, too many people have left, it'll never work, or, oh, the vision has died. Despite all of those things, or maybe even because of those things, if we can get better at recognizing that a lot of those things, if they are the result of us actually saying yes and leaning into God's invitation to do things in some ways that don't make sense, then that is actually positioning us for a success we can't see. And we need to be staying tuned in and ready so that when God says, okay, now's the time, then we're prepped to do that. And recognizing that that's what God's setting up in those situations, which I think is pretty cool. So that's kind of the end of the story, right? Well, not quite. That's the end of that pursuing the call phase. Notice that the call has now been accomplished. The call, right, the way we've defined it is the issue on God's heart was, my people are oppressed. The issue on Gideon's heart was, my people are oppressed. They met in the middle, and God says, why don't you join me in doing something about that? And that has now been brought to pass. The armies of the oppressors has been scattered. Israel's risen up, but we're not quite done yet, because there's always that final bit, right? There's the what next part of things. There's the how do we exit the call well, and what I'll call the third kind of final piece of this process. We notice each phase always led to, so, receiving the call leads to a process of consecration. Testing the call leads to a process of commitment. I would say that pursuing the call leads to a process of stewardship. How then are we going to steward the victory we've been given? How are we going to steward the result of successfully achieving the call? Now we have a company we've launched. Now we have an organization, or now we have a relationship or a community, or now something exists that didn't exist before. How are we going to steward it? So there's most of chapter 8 deals with kind of the immediate stewardship, where Gideon is following through on the process of actually, following down these armies, taking out the kings, like really making sure that this victory sticks and carries that through. So that's like the immediate. There's right after the breakthrough, there's stuff to be done, right? He wages a whole campaign. And I would argue that whole campaign, most of verse 8, from the breakthrough battle thing with the torches and the trumpets, all the way through verse 21 is the pursuing the call thing. He goes through the process of following through this campaign to actually achieve the outcome that God invited him into in the first place. But then we get to verse 22, and there's this very interesting window, just a couple of verses, about Gideon's ephod. So the Israelites said to Gideon, this is verse 22, rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Aha! Wasn't that the very thing that God said he was concerned about in the first place? Turns out he knew what he was talking about. But Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And he said, so Gideon gets that right? So there's this temptation now that has come as the result of the success, people coming in saying, wow, you are the bee's knees. You're amazing. You're awesome. And so part of stewarding the call means giving God the credit that he deserves and actually allowing that the outcome of your pursuit of the call to reflect back on God and kind of maybe draw some people to ask some questions in certain ways and so on. So like Gideon gets that right. But then verse 24, he says, I do have one request. There's always the but, right? That each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder, right? That's reasonable. And they answered, we'll be glad to give them. So they spread out a garment. Each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. And the weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels. So not too bad for one day's work or one season's campaign. But problem being, so Gideon made the gold into an ephod, the priestly garment, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So there's something instructive here. I don't want to go like too deep into this, but basically there was a way in which Gideon exited the call. And what I will say is this. My interpretation of what was a part of what was going on here is that Gideon, like he got it right in the sense of not taking the credit fully taking on the credit for himself and not allowing that to become the issue, right? Where it becomes the distraction and he's complicit in that sense of, oh, we're amazing, we did it ourselves. But I think there is something about that sense of, this was the greatest thing I've ever done or will ever do. And so now that that call has been accomplished, he kind of makes an idol out of the story of the call, right? Oh, I did, yeah, every time we see that thing, you remember that time, and it's kind of a retroactive looking thing that is, rather than exiting and saying, okay, God, what's next? Right? What's next? What do you have for me next? What's the future hold? Who am I to continue to become? What else do you want to engage with me? There's almost a plateauing or a settling into the kind of the glories of the past kind of thing. And I think we could probably all think of some examples of people we've related to, or maybe even rounds in our own life where we've kind of gone there a little too much, or we've seen what it looks like for someone else to go there a little too much. So another just principle maybe to name about stewarding the call is that as you steward the call, and as the call comes to an end and is completed, don't, the phrase not resting on your laurels, right? In the sense of becoming so enamored of the past or that thing that happened as our sense of identity. This is who I am, is what I did then. But staying flexible, staying tuned in, and continuing to lean in and engage with God, expecting Him to bring the invitation to new calls now, as in new seasons of our life. What is that going to look like? And not letting the thing that we're holding on to a little too tightly about what happened become a stumbling block for us. So that's my interpretation analysis of that. That'd be a conversation I'd be curious to have with you guys. What do you think about that? Is there maybe something that maybe I'm reading too much into that, or a different way you might interpret what he's saying there? But I do think it's relevant to recognize that the process of carrying out a call isn't over when the specific outcome is achieved. There's a whole process of stewarding. What does this mean for how I'm now going to live my life, and how I'm positioning my face towards the future, and how I engage the people around me and my sense of self as I exit this call? That's really important, and we need to give us some serious thought and attention to that. So this wraps up kind of our deeper look at the story of Gideon and this three-part process of engaging with call. So next week, for our last week, we'll have our live community call, our discussion, where we can talk about all this. I'm really looking forward to that. And also next week, I'm going to do one more video in this series to kind of take all of this, boil it down, make it a little bit more practical. I'm going to give an example or two and some other parallels so that we can really start kind of taking the paradigm or the model that I'm extrapolating from this story and dig into it just a little bit deeper in terms of what is the practical application of some of these principles for ourselves in our own life. So that'll be next week, and we'll have our live call. I'm really looking forward to engaging with that with you guys, and thanks so much for your comments and your conversations so far along the way. It's been really great. Looking forward to continuing to engage that with you as we move forward.